Thanks guys, I know it's tough. I'm standing between you and lunch. There's been a lot of really interesting speakers this morning. I'll be a contrast to some of those speakers. Hopefully I'll still be interesting. But unlike many of the organisations you've heard from today, we're tiny. We're a 90-person organisation. I'm not going to spend too much explaining a little bit about us, but I will give you some context, and then I'll dive into sort of our journey to the cloud. Most of our clients, even though we're small, we deal with 6 of the 7 largest financial service institutions in Australia. So even though we are a smallish organisation, we have to deal with the really large ones. We've been reasonably lucky. We've won a couple of awards recently, and that's partly what we'll talk about today, the journey that we've been on and what led to those awards. So just to explain, this is a real person. He's actually a friend of mine. He has no idea that I use him as an example when I explain our business. If you see him, his name's David, don't tell him. But generally, just to explain what we do as a company, all you people would have your superannuation paid for by your employing organisation. Every payroll run, they send a file to someone. We could be that someone. We take the data about your superannuation. If you give us the money, we'll gleefully take that as well. We'll reconcile it. We'll make sure it adds up. We'll make sure the numbers are correct, the data's correct, and then we'll send it off to the to the superannuation funds. So that's what our job is. We're the market leader in that segment. It's a small segment. Australia is one of the best performing superannuation markets in the world. We're about 40% market share of that. So what does my friend do? My friend, he doesn't use, up until this service, what he used to do was he used to sit at home on a Sunday once a month, log in all the superannuation funds to make payments on behalf of each of his employees. Now here's a small example, but if you take someone like BHP Billiton, who's our client, they pay to 4,000 superannuation funds a year, a payroll run. So that's the service that we provide. 3 years ago, the federal government created an initiative called SuperStream, which was essentially to automate that process that I just described. Because at that time, roughly half of the transactions was all done manually. And so as part of this was the journey we went on. We grew by 450% in size in 2.5 years. We redeveloped the way our platform works, so we redeveloped our platform based on the distributed microservices. We changed the way we developed that platform. We changed the technology stack that we built it with. And then the last piece of the puzzle was the infrastructure was becoming a brake on our ability to support the business moving forward. And so that's when we started to look at this journey to the cloud. And you'll notice on the tail end of that slide, it starts to talk about, as we decided to do this, hopefully I can say this because there's no one from Oracle here, but we also decided to get off Oracle and migrate our database technology to Postgres. It was just too hard to use Oracle in the cloud, at least for us. So we did that as well. There were people here that I've already spoken to that are going to argue about this. But I've got to tell you, when you look at the economics of both infrastructure and security today, I would argue none of us really have the scale or the ability to do it properly. And there's some probably, it'll catch up with you later if you're a bigger organisation, but infrastructure and security is now a scale industry. And the reason why I say that is it's not the cost of necessarily buying the equipment, it's the cost of keeping the people trained so that they can maintain it properly. It's the cost of buying all the tools and the technologies to protect yourself against hackers. So let me give you 2 really simple examples for us. So for us, if we had to buy intrusion detection and protection and do it ourselves, we're roughly looking at between $80,000 and $150,000 in expenditure. I can go buy that service from a cloud provider for about $150 a month. If I look at For people that are topical about the ATO and the outages that they've experienced, we have similar sort of storage hardware that they have. If I look at the cost of training a couple of the guys up so that they can actually maintain it properly, that's about $100,000. That's actually probably our entire training budget for our sized organisation. And so it's for those reasons that we can't develop the expertise. Like one of the banks, their pen testing team is bigger than our entire organisation. How do you compete? And I'm arguing you don't. And the market's getting more complex. It's not getting simpler. And the way that we connect more with more organisations, which increases the complexity, you've got this whole concept of defence in depth that most people still don't get their heads around. Most organisations I come across still believed in this, fort mentality. I have a firewall that's going to stop people from getting in. I don't have to worry about it. Well, that's not true anymore. Any persistent hacker will get in if they persist long enough. And there's nothing you can do about it other than mitigate the risk and try and react quickly for it, which is why, as the speaker earlier said, the incident response plans are really important. And then lastly, the last point on the slide there is, the statistics on hacking is just, very depressing. Budgets are still going up, as the figures from Forrester, 22% to 28% last year. That's an enormous amount of money. As one of the speakers referenced earlier this morning, that money didn't stop Target from getting hacked. They actually spend a lot of money on preventing security vulnerabilities, and they still got hacked. So that would be my first key proposition. That's what led us to go to the cloud, and part of what we said was we're going to go all in. So we looked at the market, and we said the market was really made up in four key sectors. The first was what we called the self-service sector, and that's probably where most of us started. That's the guys that, hand over their credit card, they jump on AWS, they spin up a few servers, they do it all themselves. In fact, my friend David I referenced before, he does that on occasion. So we call that the self-service market. And that's where a lot of people start. It's interesting, the research shows that they're moving away from that. The second category, which is the one we fit into, is essentially the commodity or trader sector. And what we mean by that is we've formed a view that essentially infrastructure is a commoditized service, and what we need to do is to tap into someone else who has scale and have that work for us. But the way we do that is we use a cloud management platform. The one we looked at two closely, which was Scala and RightScale, and we use that, and it provides a consistent layer that then gives you a consistent look and feel into the various cloud service providers. So at the moment, we're sort of running three. So we run a vSphere cluster sort of like a private cloud. So we've got that on a temporary basis. We've been doing a fair bit of work with AWS, and since Christmas, we've started with Azure. And then when Google set up in Australia, we'll start working with them. But we have the ability through something like RightScale, I can take, and we've done this, I can take our core legacy application, so we're a software as a service, multi-tenanted sort of application. I can have that, and I have had that application sitting in AWS. I can tear it down, move it across to our vSphere cluster, and have it back up and running in less than 4 hours. So that's part of the advantages you get out of that. The third category is what I call the best of breed. There's a lot of companies out there that are doing that. They go out, they grab Salesforce.com, they get Office 365, they get a bunch of other people, and they try and then knit it all together. I was at an Azure workshop last year, and they asked how many people have got 100% in the cloud. There was one guy put his hand up. Fortunately for me, it was the guy sitting next to me. And it was GrainCorp. And I said, that's amazing. How do you do that? And that's the strategy. They'd outsourced their SAP implementation to SoftLayer. They had Office 365. They were doing all that sort of stuff. I said, how's it working for you? He said, it's not. We can't knit it together. We can't get it to work. So we're actually now in the process of unbundling it and trying to pull it back. But it's a strategy. And then the last one there, I called the one-stop shop. By that, it's like if you go to IBM or Rackspace or those guys, sit back, they'll do it all for you. You just hand over the money and they'll work closely with your teams and do it. We didn't go for, obviously, that approach. We went for the right scale approach, and we also went down, which is the commodity or broker-trader type model, and we also went heavily down the automation route. Statistically, because everyone, I'm a CIO, so I get paid a lot of money to explain to my business why we're special and we're doing such a unique job. But I have some statistics to prove this. So if you look at it statistically in Australia, these are 2015 figures from Forrester. 2016, I think. Only 2% of companies in Australia are actually 100% in the public cloud. Of that, many of them were born in the cloud. There were startups that went that way. So the number of people that are actually traditional corporates that are in the cloud is a very small number. That's the number that we're part of. So we're 100. We're not quite at the end of the journey yet, but we're on the map to be 100% in the public cloud. That's our target end state. And if you look at it, only about 14.5% of applications are in the cloud. I think Trevor last night said this figure's a year old. I think Trevor said last night the figure's about 20%. So still a long way to go. The other thing we did was we looked at pricing. So we did this. This was part of the submission that went to our board to justify why we were going to move to the cloud. So I just took 10 configurations. It was a Sunday afternoon. I looked at spot versus normal. The saving was substantial. And on pre-production loads like performance testing or even dev loads, you can tap into this. It's not actually that hard. And so you can potentially make a significant saving. The other thing we did was we've tapped into some research that was done in the US. The story's pretty well the same. If you shop around, you can drive down the cost. It takes some effort, some work. But the interesting thing about this slide, and the reason why I like it, if you look at the numbers on the left, is that green bars. If you shop around and mix and match, then you can actually get the cheapest price. So one of the rationales for our board about going down the right scale route and going to this multi-cloud provider strategy, which is what we have, was we have the ability to move loads around. So we've currently got a load that we can deploy in a vSphere cluster, we've deployed in AWS, and we're now deploying it into Azure. So we can move them across. And as I said to you before, it takes us less than 4 hours to do that. As an order of magnitude, for us to take our core application that we run for our clients from a standing start with nothing there, in just under an hour and a half, we can have the servers, the application, and it all up and running now. That used to take us more than 10 weeks, That's a huge, huge difference when you can blow away your entire environment and get it back up and running in less than an hour and a half. The other thing we did, because several people have talked about private clouds, so what we did was we took a scaled version of our application, we took it to a hosting provider, we said, go price this up and run it in your data center. Then we took it and ran it with AWS. It was marginally more expensive to run it with AWS once you start to look at some of the discounts you can get. So we sort of formed the view that over time, if we're smart, if we mix and match, that we can just do all public cloud. We don't have to worry about this hybrid environment, which I know many people did. Our original strategy was actually to go hybrid. But when we did the analysis and we did the pilot, it didn't make any sense. So we just said, we're going to go straight in. We'll go all public. That led us to, once you start to look at that pricing, you start to realise, hey, this is a skill that we don't have in IT. In fact, I would argue, there was a guy here earlier from Energex, I would argue the skill you need to do pricing in the cloud is actually much closer to energy trading skills. And so, it's created a whole new paradigm because you need to start to think about load and how you match that load and against pricing. And we have the ability to shift it around to different providers so we can shop across their pricing schemes. It also means, so for example, I think it was 18 months ago, Azure put their prices up by 27% over a weekend. It gives us a degree of protection against that. What we've done is we've gone heavily down the automation route. If you look at what people do, when people talk about lift and drop into the cloud, what they're actually talking about is a mental model that's predicated on the cloud is just the same as what I currently do, it's just someone else's infrastructure. That's that blue bar at the bottom, it's the left-hand side of the chart. Where the real value starts to cut in, we think, and the results tend to support this, is if you go down the fully automation path. So literally now, I can just press, I wouldn't do it because I'm not technical enough, but I could press a button and that whole process I talked about where servers are deployed, application codes deployed, and the thing's up and running, I've sat there and watched it happen, and all it takes is literally, I'm not exaggerating, it takes 2 clicks of the button. 2 presses. And once you start to do that, that gives you amazing flexibility, and you can start to think about doing things in ways you've never thought about doing them before. So, for example, our DR now, is just, we don't bother having a hot site, we just have a real-time replicated database, because we know if we ever had to click over to in a DR environment, we can build the whole DR application stack in less than an hour and a half. So we don't have to have them running at the same time. We don't have to worry about keeping them in sync. Patch management, which, if you look at the research, we talked about security. If you look at the research, patch management is still one of the biggest sources of vulnerabilities in organisations. We can patch every day, and that's the model we're adopting. I know a lot of organisations, they get all their patches together. I mean, obviously we're not talking about the critical ones, you do that straight away, but there's a lot of non-critical ones. Instead of bundling them up and doing it once a month, we can do it every day now, and that's the model we're migrating to at the moment. It also takes, your ops guys take a little while to get their heads around this, because most ops guys, they're tactile people, like they like playing on hardware, they usually have the screwdrivers in their pockets if they're like our guys. This is a different model. So what happens here is if you get a problem with a server, you don't go and fix that server anymore. You go back, because all this stuff is now software. So you go back to the source code, you change the source code, and then you redeploy it. It's a very different model. But the advantage of it is it really helps you to drive the automation, and you get a big uplift in quality. So for example, one of the problems we had, and I think I talk about this a little bit later, is we used to get between 60 and 70% of the problems that occurred on deployment were due to configuration drift. That figure's now dropped to less than 5%, because it just doesn't happen anymore, can't happen. And the reason why it can't happen, this is our architecture for those that are interested, but the three key design principles that we've had, and we're pretty disciplined about doing this, is I've got to be able to automate it. If I can't automate it, we're not going to do it. So anything that's hardware-based, we're getting rid of or have got rid of. We're not going to lock into a cloud service provider. So there's a lot of nice nifty features that AWS and Azure and those other guys will tell you about. We don't make any use of them. Unless we can migrate them between service providers, we don't use them. And the last thing is we're currently running a little bit behind on our project, but we've said to the team, if you have a choice between doing this right and meeting a deadline, do it right. This is fundamental. This is the foundation for the house that you're building figuratively. You've got to get this right. And I'm sure you picked that up from the panel, the security panel earlier today. Security was built in at the start. We're not going to jeopardise that. And we need to take the time to make sure it works properly. Concept of brittleness. You guys probably don't realise it, but your ops guys compensate for failings or tech debt in your code every time they deploy. The example I'd use, we had some code that a contractor built over 2 years ago. I never knew this, but it had never, ever built properly, ever. And every time we deployed it, the ops guys would do some magic to get it running and working. When we looked to migrate it to the cloud and through this automation process, we realised that. So 40% of the effort that we've put into this project is being driven on fixing up tech debt, things like this, where this code now builds properly. It builds properly in a fully automated fashion. It's reproducible, it's version controlled, and a whole bunch of other things. And there's a definition around that. It does come at a cost. And this was some of the statistics. As I quoted ours was configuration drift drop from about 60 to 70% of the deployment errors to less than 5%. And that should probably disappear once we've got everything automated properly. What have we achieved so far? We've obviously addressed a whole bunch of the tech debt. We've automated virtually 100% of the code. I was waiting for a call today to say whether we finished or not, because today was supposed to be the last little bit. I don't know if it has, but if not, we're close to it. We've done that for both our legacy environments. So we run a traditional Java blob of code as our legacy app, and then we've gone down the distributed microservices route for our new stuff. There's about 150 of them. They've all been automated now. We've decommissioned 4 of our physical environments. Our definition of done is when I turn or have someone turn it off. So it's pretty black and white. When you turn something off, the new stuff actually has to really work. We've spun up. The thing that we've found is now clients can ring us up. I said to you before, we run a shared environment or a multi-tenanted environment. We get clients like the big banks that want to have their own dedicated test environment. They can ring up now, and then we can provision one in just over an hour and a half. And so we've actually found a number of our clients that have wanted to do that. Interesting thing is, in the first year alone with no promotion, that constitutes nearly 5% of our revenue stream. So it's created revenue opportunities that we didn't really envisage or thought would be there. It's great for the clients because in the past, everyone had to get the code deployed to production at the same time. Now we can say, you can have yours, you can keep it there for a while, you can test it in your own environment. So they get a lot more flexibility, they're happier as well. And obviously we've been doing a lot on upgrading our security, and that's just going to continue to occur. What's been really difficult? Understanding where the problems were going to be in terms of that tech debt, that was really hard. AWS and those guys, generally speaking, the cloud service providers, as soon as you tell them, I don't want to tie in with one provider, I want to have a multi-cloud sort of strategy, it's amazing how quickly they lose interest. So actually getting that interest. And then the other thing is there's a whole bunch of little things that they all do to lock you in. So for example, you can't take a backup in AWS and then deploy it somewhere else. It won't work. So we've actually had to create and test and deploy a backup. It's based on open source software, but we've got a backup solution now where I can take a backup out of AWS, I can deploy it into a vSphere cluster, or I can deploy it into Azure environment, and vice versa, and that works, and we've tested it. But that took a lot of effort because people aren't out there, generally speaking, providing that capability. We did have some early issues around getting the basics right. So things took a little bit longer to report. That deployment, obviously I'm going to tell you the good bits, but when we first started this journey with RightScale, it took over 4 hours to deploy an environment. It was killing some of the dev guys as they were waiting for new environments to get spun up. So we've put a lot of work into improving the performance. So now that it's down to less than an hour and a half, and that's from scratch, that's an acceptable outcome for the guys, but we had to put in a lot of work to do that. And the other thing that they don't really like a lot is that whole process I said where you don't fix things, you change the source code, because infrastructure is just code now. And you can apply all those quality metrics and approaches that the application developing guys have been doing for years. You can now apply that to infrastructure. They don't really like the fact that I can't just patch the software, I have to redeploy it. But you know, they get used to it over time. What surprised us? The amount of tech debt. Definitely that surprised us. Strangely enough, notwithstanding what I just said, we've recently done I wouldn't say post-implementation review, but we've done a re-baselining of our budget. Even though we've spent a whole lot more effort on fixing our tech debt, the overall project's actually still under budget. It's amazing. But what we found is the actual automation process, like using RightScale, getting that set up and running, actually took a whole lot less, like probably a half to 60% less than what we thought it was going to do going in. And that's even after we did pilots. So that's really what's saved us. Obviously, RightScale is like, if you look at the quadrant stuff, it's the magic quadrant sort of leader. You can still tell though, it's a maturing market. There's not a lot of people out there. There's not a lot of people out there that are doing what we're doing in this way, even the other RightScale people. As I mentioned to you, we were a little surprised that the cloud service providers weren't that interested. Like, I know we're not a big company. We're actually a pretty decent credential though. Like, we're the market leader in superannuation, which is the best market, third best market in the world. But it's interesting, most people still want to try and tie you in to their service. Some issues that we've had, it does take people's, I think it was Andrew from Seek talked about logging. The issue with logging, devs still make this assumption they just write stuff to files and the file's going to be there. They have to start thinking it's not going to be there. And how do I deal with that? You can't just assume that. And then the other thing is all of our automation process, it is brittle. So that's a good thing, because if you've got it wrong, you know really, really quickly that it's wrong. But it does mean people have to be much more disciplined and structured and have to start applying all those software development deployment techniques like the CI/CD stuff to infrastructure. And infrastructure now has bugs. So we have a test environment just for our infrastructure code, and we test that. And it's a little bit different, but the guys get used to it. Biggest challenges to date, I'm going to go over that really quickly. This is no different than the previous speaker, it's the people. It's getting them to think differently about how you apply infrastructure and how you provide that service. That's been the biggest thing. People with the skills aren't out there. We've had to completely retrain all the guys. And in fact, we've now got to the point where we're hiring grads in, because it's easier to train grads who have never done infrastructure in how to do this stuff than it is to take traditional infrastructure guys who are very hardware-centric and orientated and get them to reorientate themselves. Because most of them don't actually like being developers, and that's sort of where they end up. So observation, I'd say automation is critical. That's what drives most of the value and benefits. Obviously, we've been lucky too. We've been working with some great partners that have helped us on that journey. So we've got a company called Office. They look after RightScale and help us with that. The Sumo Logic guys and AppDynamics have been great as well from the monitoring, because monitoring becomes hugely more important in this sort of environment, because you're sort of so much, one step removed. Cultural change has obviously been the biggest issue that we've faced. It's still one we're working with, and we're still struggling with how do you get the people, but what we've tried to do is work with them, take them on the journey with us. As the previous speaker said, we try and leave no one behind, but it does take time and effort. And the other thing I'd mention too, we did try the sort of big bang approach at the start. It just never works. The team could never get their heads around it. It was too much to bite off. So what we've found that works really effective, break your project down to chunks. You can run multiple chunks at the same time. Break it down into chunks that people can get their heads around. Get that done, then build to the next step. And if you do that, we went slow at the start, but as soon as we started to do that, we've actually really sped up and got some really amazing results. So on that note, and given that I said this was about ruthless automation at the start, I thought it was apt that I finished on this cartoon. Thank you.